lunch waiting for anyone, so we will go on to item 10 and try and get through this quite quickly, another important piece of the puzzle.
Are we doing the presentation as well?
And we'll just, Matthew, if everyone can introduce themselves briefly, and we'll just try and click through the presentation quite quickly, and then we can have some questions. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Matthew Blakey. I'm the Acting Chief Sustainability Officer here at Auckland Council.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Helen Mahoney and I'm a Sustainability and Resilience Advisor in the Chief Sustainability Office.
Good afternoon, John Bishop, the Group Treasurer.
Good afternoon, Andrew John, Funding Manager in Treasury.
So we're here today to speak to you as members of the Chief Sustainability Office and the Treasury team on the C40 Divest Invest Declaration. So the purpose of the agenda item is us to provide you with an overview of the C40 Divest Invest Declaration and recommend that Auckland Council signs this declaration. The C40 Divest Invest Declaration is focused on cities divesting from their investments in fossil fuel assets, fossil fuel producing companies, and also investing further in sustainable finance and climate solutions, so financial investments towards climate solutions. The C40 Divest Invest Declaration, the declaration is tied up with our membership of C40. So as you are aware, C40 is a network of global cities that are taking bold action on climate change. As part of our membership of C40 cities, we are required to meet certain leadership standards. There is no fee to join C40, but we need to meet these leadership standards in order to continue our membership. So as part of these leadership standards, we are required to endorse an additional declaration, one additional declaration by 2022. Endorsing the Divest Invest Declaration would meet this requirement, and it would add to two declarations that we have already endorsed, those being the Advancing Towards Zero Waste Declaration and the Green and Healthy Streets Declaration, formerly called the Fossil Fuel Free Streets Declaration. Those two declarations, the Advancing Towards Zero Waste Declaration and the Green and Healthy Streets Declaration, are reported on annually, and as part of our commitment to those declarations, we have completed a high-level action plan, or perhaps more appropriately, a summary table, as you can see here on the screen. So on the right-hand side there, you can see the Green and Healthy Streets Declaration. As part of that declaration, we made a commitment to procure only zero-emission buses from 2025. As you know, that commitment was brought forward in the 10-year budget, and we set the accelerated deadline of the 1st of July 2021. So this is very much a standard format in terms of how we apply to a declaration and how we report on it. So the C40 Divest Declaration sets out three commitments. The first commitment is for a city to take all possible steps to divest city assets from fossil fuel companies, and also to increase financial investments in climate solutions to help promote decent jobs and a just and green economy. So this is very much focused on ensuring that the money we spend goes towards financing positive climate outcomes. The second commitment is very much focused on pension funds and calling on pension funds to divest from fossil fuel companies and increase financial investments in climate solutions. Not applicable to Auckland based on the pension fund relationship that we don't have. So the third commitment is very much focused on advocacy, and this is focused on advocating for fossil fuel free and sustainable finance by other investors and all levels of government, including by promoting the importance of strong long-term climate policies and demanding greater transparency. So this is very much focused on us delivering an impact beyond just Auckland. So very much taking an advocacy response to take others with us, looking at central government, looking at the private sector and seeing what we can achieve in terms of an impact beyond Auckland. There are 5 requirements that the declaration outlines. We are required, if signing up, to take one or more of the following actions. So the first action is focused on making a commitment to increase investments in climate solutions and the green economy and to divest municipal investments from fossil fuel companies, which we've already done, and we'll come on to that. The following two requirements relate to pension funds, and as I've mentioned, they are not relevant to the Auckland context. The fourth requirement there is to monitor progress and communicate this progress to C40 on an annual basis by requesting regular progress updates on how the relevant portfolios are managing climate-related financial risks and opportunities. We'll be touching on that later in the presentation. And the fifth and final requirement is to use our influence to advocate for investments in climate solutions and divestment from fossil fuel companies by other actors, such as private financial institutions and our regional and national governments. And this is very much about Auckland taking the opportunity, taking this platform to promote what we're already doing, the great work we're already doing, and delivering further impact. I'll now pass on to Helen Mahoney.
Thanks, Matthew. So Auckland Council has already made multiple commitments to use sustainable finance mechanisms to drive our climate goals, but also to support the broader shift of our financial system to one that's more sustainable. This is detailed in Tcfd Framework within our economy priority, where we have committed to redirect capital towards sustainability outcomes, but also improve how we value social and environmental impacts alongside our financial impacts as well, and then build that broader awareness within our financial system. And as founding members of the Aotearoa Circle, we have also made a similar commitment to support the shift in our financial system. I'm going to pass you on to John, who's going to talk to some of the activities we're doing in more detail.
Thanks, Helen. So look, some of the financial things we do in this area, any council investments are covered by our responsible investment policy. Now that was modified when we had our diversified financial asset portfolio a few years ago, and the key plank of that was to exclude any divestments in the production of fossil fuels. We also have a sustainable finance framework, which is here to support our issue of green bonds. And if I talk about our green bond program, just reminding you, what is a green bond? It's just like a normal bond that we raise, except its proceeds are used to finance projects which have a positive environmental or climate benefit. So it's a use of proceeds bonds. Why do we issue them? There's a few advantages. One is they tend to be slightly cheaper than normal bonds. They also increasingly attract a larger pool of investors. Really, green bonds are becoming mainstream. So more of the world's investors and fund managers are now focused very clearly on bonds which have a green or sustainable outcome. Importantly too, it shows a lot of transparency around what we're raising money for. And also it aligns with our funding and our strong sustainability objectives. Council has been a leader in the green bond market in New Zealand. We were the first New Zealand issuer to issue a green bond, and we've been one of the most active issuers in the market since. We've raised 850 million through green bonds since 2018, and our most recent bond was a 30-year, $500 million green bond, which has won multiple awards. What do we use green bonds to fund? A range of projects which have positive climate and sustainability benefits, including the CRL, electric trains, cycleways, and a number of water projects. To keep our investors informed, each year we publish a green bond annual report, and that details what we're spending the proceeds of these bonds on and how they contribute towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and achieving broader sustainability objectives. Thank you.
So one of the actions that we may choose to deliver on as part of this declaration is to align our reporting with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework. So Auckland Council has actually been voluntarily disclosing under this framework for the last 2 years, and we'll be releasing our third climate-related disclosure in the next annual report. Essentially, the Tcfd framework requires organisations to disclose on how climate-related financial risks and opportunities are embedded within their organisation. The framework itself is structured around 4 key areas of a business. They are risk management, governance, strategy, and metrics and targets. And then there are 11 recommended disclosures within that framework that we are required to disclose on. Now, part of the Tcfd framework is for organisations to carry out a climate change risk assessment using different climate scenarios. This is also referred to as scenario analysis. And this will be carried out in the next stage of our Tcfd response. Undergoing this assessment is going to give us a much better understanding of how we might perform under different climate scenarios so that we can make more informed strategic decisions. But it's also going to allow us to understand how we are financially exposed to climate change, which will inform how and where we allocate capital, moving it away from activity that might expose us further to climate-related financial risks. So as well as the activity that we've just detailed, there's also a lot of work that is currently underway and is in the pipeline. So as we spoke about today, we have an investment of $152 million in climate action, and that will be carried out over the next 10 years. We've also acknowledged that most of our funding is will need to be through mechanisms such as green bonds in the future. So in response to this, we are expanding our eligible asset list, and that means identifying more assets and projects that meet the green bond criteria. We're also working with the rest of the group as well to identify other sustainable finance tools such as sustainability-linked loans and bonds that we might use to drive further sustainable and climate and social outcomes as well. And then, as just detailed, we'll be carrying out a climate change risk assessment to understand what are the climate-related financial risks that are most material to the group. Okay, so as discussed, we are demonstrating much alignment to the declaration. When it comes to government, we're really leaders in the sustainable finance space, but there is still work that we will need to do as part of this declaration. So in order to deliver on the requirements of this declaration, we'll need to increase our financial investments in climate solutions, and that also includes increasing investments in solutions that help to deliver a just and green economy. We also need to play more of an advocacy role as well, and that includes being an advocate to central government, investors and other financial institutions to also invest in climate solutions and increase their use of sustainable finance. And then we'll need to monitor this progress and communicate that to C40 on an annual basis. So that concludes our presentation. We'll welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Councillor Walker, your question. Councillor Kumar.
So I've just got a question, and I've just generated a quick brainstorm of some issues that could be risks. So, for example, Auckland Council is one of the largest farmers, if not the largest farmer in the Auckland region, and we have significant methane emissions from ruminants. I would expect that would be identified as a risk, particularly given that the IPCC has identified that reducing methane emissions is one of the fastest ways, if not the fastest way, that we can actually reduce our emissions footprint. So that's a question. In terms of the group, are we including our investments in Ports of Auckland and Auckland Airport as it goes to risks? Obviously, Auckland Airport is involved with long-haul flights and the like. They have an interest in that. Ports of Auckland has risks in terms of vessels that dock in Auckland, many of which are high emitters in terms of their carbon footprint and the management of that in port. Are we analysing any risks associated with transport projects that we or the government is investing in the region that actually intensify our carbon footprint and lock us in? and there may be a number of examples of those. In terms of influence, obviously we bank with various institutions. Are we examining the bank or banks that we effectively invest in or place money in, and how those banks are acting in respect of their investments, because we know that banks invest in a number of areas. So they're just a few things that I generated fairly quickly. There may be others, and I just wonder if you're considering those risks, for example.
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor. So quite a few issues then, and I will look to address those, and perhaps others who are with me may wish to pick up on some of the more specific points, in particular around finance. Just in terms of the framing of the response, I'd like to just clarify that the declaration we're discussing today is focused on divesting from fossil fuel producing companies. So that would be oil, gas and coal, for example. Also recognising that clearly there are carbon impacts of other organisations, but they are separate to the declaration that we're discussing today in terms of those issues should be dealt with and should be discussed, but in terms of the declaration, they sit with outside of the scope of the declaration. So that's just a point of clarification I wanted to make. But in terms of just going through your points, in terms of Auckland Council being the largest farmer in the region, I believe you said, and that being identified as a risk and methane being flagged in the IPCC report, that would be outside the scope of the declaration, but it is something that needs careful consideration. And obviously, there is work ongoing in terms of how the best practices of the agricultural sector of farmers can be adopted more widely through the sector to deliver more widespread change. And that's something that certainly needs to be looked at, but would be outside of the scope of the declaration. In terms of your specific reference to Auckland Airport and Ports of Auckland, it is outside the scope of the declaration. It would be a conversation, discussion that perhaps should occur, but I would suggest it's something that would need to happen in the future around those assets being exposed to climate risk. And certainly through the work on TCFD, the work that Helen alluded to in terms of our climate related risk, in terms of financial risk, there is scenario analysis that will be delivered to understand what the risks will be to our assets under different climate scenarios. So that work is ongoing, and we will have further insight on that. In terms of transport projects, and you touched on the risks associated with transport projects, I think one of the things that sustainable finance addresses, and please add further detail to this, I'm not the sustainable finance expert here, is that sustainable finance is aimed at projects that deliver positive climate outcomes. So we would be looking at funding projects that deliver those positive climate outcomes, such as electric trains, walking cycle infrastructure. So by directing our finance towards those type of projects, we would be supporting those.
Thank you.
For you, Mr. Chair, I could probably use some clarification. I'm making the assumption that the money that we have in a bank is an investment, that the money that we're raising through the long-term plan in terms of capital and operation that we're investing in livestock is an investment, and our investment in transport is an investment. And I would have thought that the parameters that I see here would cover off those forms of investment. Investment is not just where we place the money externally, it's where we locate it internally, because we have to raise money to do all of those things, and that might even be by way of green bonds or whatever.
At the moment, we have had a workshop on the farms and community facilities focused, and they are working on it. At the moment, the issue is that we actually earn an income, so it's actually not we're not buying. Yeah, we're not like borrowing to buy cows. It's actually the other way.
We are effectively.
Yeah, but the issue is we have had a workshop on that, and that is going to come through community facilities on how we can, plant up more of our regional parks instead of having grazing. But the issue is if we're mowing that, we're using diesel and petrol by mowing that. So it's a fine balance. But I think it's to the C40, this specific paper, it's not related, but happy to have more conversation around that.
I guess my concern is that there could be an element of greenwashing in what we're putting forward here. It's just a personal.
So just through you, Chair, just to expand on maybe the comments which have been made, and I think they're good ones, but, a lot of the stuff that's referred to is, as Matthew said, outside the scope of this, but it doesn't mean, there's an advantage of signing on to this. It does put the spotlight on some of the activities that we do, and, it's clear that not everything we do is probably as green or sustainable as it should be. And, signing on something like this does put the spotlight on what we invest in, what our activities are, and can we do them better? So for example would be that if we couldn't going forward raise most of our money in a green bond format, you might start to question, well, are some of our investments the most appropriate? Is there a better way of doing it? Just on the specific question about the banks that we deal with, again, it's outside the scope of this, but again, banks will invest in a range of different businesses. They are having an increasing focus on those businesses which deliver positive environmental and sustainability outcomes. That doesn't mean they won't still lend to other providers, but you are starting to see things like pricing differentials in that activity. So certainly if you take some of the Australasian banks, they themselves will issue things like green and sustainable bonds, but on the other side, of course, they'll probably still invest to some of the, say, the Australian miners.
Thank you. Councillor Coombe, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Kia ora koutou, and it's great to see this work across the Treasury team and sustainability team, and very happy to support the recommendation. Just a partai around whether possible additional actions could include blue bonds, and we talked about those. We've had a meeting to discuss that, wearing my co-chair of the Hauraki Golf Forum hat, and I think, John and Helen, when you were explaining it, a blue bond is essentially a green bond, but is there something more that we could be doing there in terms of this declaration?
Through the chair, I'm not an expert on blue bonds, but what I can confirm is that the wording of the declaration is in such a way that it enables us to shape our response. So in terms of increasing our financial investments in climate solutions, which is what the declaration is asking us to do, we can certainly articulate in our action plan, the summary table, that is something we're progressing or investigating, whatever is appropriate. It's not restricted to green bonds. It is looking at sustainable finance or different forms of investment.
Thank you. I think maybe we decided too that blue bonds isn't necessarily the right word for it, but it was investment that could be directed towards the improvements to the Hauraki Golf.
Yeah, through you, Chair, just to expand on that. So, I mean, blue bonds are a subset of green bonds, and there's certainly initiatives we'd look to run probably through our wider green bond framework, rather than probably have a separate sort of framework and pool for specific blue bonds. But it certainly can be a focus of our green bond initiatives.
Thank you, and there was a lot of support for that from the Hauraki Golf Forum. Kia ora.
Good. Thank you. Member Wilcox.
Yeah, I think I brought this question up once before, and just looking at the C40, I'm struggling to understand a little bit about the green bond. I certainly don't see Dubai, Houston or Austin divesting themselves of all their fossil fuel investments. So I'm just kind of a little bit concerned that we're using the green bond when there's no real standard. It only represents 1% of all bond raising. And I'm wondering whether we're getting into a situation where we're just a bit like we were before, where we kind of ended up with differentials and fractionated debt packages, and they all named different things, but they all mean the same. Because there is no standard, am I correct? There is no standard for a green bond. The standard for a green bond is environmental and sustainable solutions or outcomes, but there's no standard as to what that outcome is. Or is Cicero not doing that work now?
Through you, Chair, look, there are green bond standards. We have a green bond framework, which must meet certain green bond principles. So it's very definitive what can qualify as a green bond or not. And to your other point, I think, well, it might represent at the moment 1% of the bonds in the world. If you go back 5 years, it would have been 0.001. And I think the trend is only going one way. And I think you'll find it becomes mainstream financing. And whether it's sort of a green bond or some other sustainability or social outcome bond, that is where the world is heading.
So my question is, who actually enforces the standards?
So I might probably let Andrew or Helen answer this, but in general, there's a framework and there's green bond principles, and we have to get that audited, that we comply with those principles and standard each year by Ernst & Young, and that's what will go in our green bond annual report. So it's quite a thorough process that we go through to verify that what we're spending the money on complies with those frameworks, and that it does meet those sustainability and climate outcomes which are defined.
Look, it's not about anything else, but it's about using the name green, because I've seen offerings before of green bonds that were actually just updating properties and things like that and used as a debt package and moved on from there. And I think that's been very clear in the US, where they've used it as backup and then collateralised that debt into a package and it's still part of a green bond. So I just want to understand that, because I'm just concerned that we're using these words green, but others aren't applying the same standards that we are. And that could be the case of the C40. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, I should expand on that. I mean, the standards around the world on green bonds, they are evolving, and you do have, different standards around the world, but generally they're becoming, the goal is to have them more aligned. But again, if you look at all the issuers in New Zealand and through Europe, they follow very strict standards and processes to verify that they do meet that set criteria.
So were you going to tell me about this standard, how this standard evolved, or are we going to leave that for an offline discussion?
I can add a few points to that. There is something called the Green Bond Principles and the Climate Bonds Initiative, which set up some of these standards. So it identifies asset classes and what qualifies, what kind of investment will qualify as a green bond. So those are, and what's happening now is that in Europe they've got the EU taxonomy, which defines it further. So it defines, if you're investing in sustainable transport, what that looks like. And so that the standards are being built, as you rightfully say, it's an area that's evolving. But what you're saying is that there's greater clarity on these, and it is continuing to evolve. I think there was a period when, as John highlighted, when it was a bit blurred. But I think there's greater clarity now, and the EU taxonomy is something that's becoming quite is just taking place now, and it's something that will define what green bond issuance would look like, and sustainable debt products would look like. So it's an evolving space, I would say, Council, and it's we are not heading back; we're just moving forward in the space.
So I'll comment now. My issue is our version of a green bond may not be the same as a North American version, as a North Asian version, as an African version, and so my concern is that we're saying we're green bond, but others actually a lower standard or a different standard, and that concerns me, that we're signing up to something that we don't know what around the world is the standard. And except the name. The only thing that's in common at the moment is the name and the sustainable. And for me, that's an issue. Thank you.
Just through you, Chair, to expand on that, I mean, we're using globally recognised green bond standards. And so, for example, our most recent 30-year, 500 million green bond, that attracted investors from all around the world because they recognise and accept the green bond principles and the climate initiative standards as being at the top end. So while there may be some other jurisdictions which don't have the same rigour around them, I can assure you that they do apply to New Zealand and other, European and destinations. So I don't think we should have that concern about the green bonds that council issues.
Thank you. Member Wilson, last question.
Kia ora. Just to give some context around why we pose the questions that we pose, it does, Independent Māori Stat Board has a board work program and that relates to the environmental resilience, protection and management that's specific to the Māori perspective. So I'm just putting in context why the question was posed around green bonds. And my question, albeit I don't want a detail level, following on from what we're required to do is, if the council does endorse this declaration and commits to further increasing investment in climate solutions, how will the piece of work around prioritising where this funding goes, don't need to have the answer right now, so how will that be prioritised if this resolution moves forward? And how will Māori-focused and Māori-led climate initiatives be prioritised as part of this process? I don't expect you to know the answer right off the top of your head. If it can't be done right now, then I'll be seeking that some answer would come back for part of the Secretariat to ensure that that happens as our work that we're part of this committee.
Through the chair, kia ora, Member Wilson. So in terms of the 2 points you've raised there, what I can confirm is that signing the declaration is a high-level agreement, a high-level commitment to increase financial investments in climate solutions. That would be us committing to that over time. How we implement that, and I think that's perhaps the point that you're raising here in terms of how do we ensure that the piece around prioritisation and also the important piece around Māori-focused and Māori-led climate programmes. How we do that is for us as a council to work on further to ensure that that takes place in an appropriate way. So signing the declaration does not set a direction to that, but what it does do is commit to increasing investment in climate solutions for us then to work through how we implement that. And I'd be very keen to discuss that element of it with you, the Secretariat, further.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone. I have moved this, and Councillor Simpson is happy to second, and she would like to. Councillor Simpson would like to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to remind everybody what we're doing here. We signed up to C40, which is a network of global cities committed to addressing climate change. We've signed 2 declarations, and we are required to sign 1 more before the beginning of next year. This one is an easy one to sign, in my opinion, because financially we're already doing it. So we're not actually really buying into anything that we're not already doing. Yes, I know there are some extra stuff, but we've just spent hours on the last item telling everybody that we were committed to sort of climate investment. We have our green bonds, and let me just talk to you about green bonds. Green bonds are a way to fund things like our cycleways, electric trains. They're specific. It might not be the same as everybody else's, but who cares? This is our declaration, our bit for what we are going to do. So with respect to Dubai and everywhere else, that's fine. But for us, let's look at what we're doing. And we're going to probably do another green bond issue domestically before Christmas, and maybe bring forward another one offshore. The government don't do it. We are leading New Zealand in this space. And I have confidence that actually in signing this declaration, this is putting Auckland at the forefront of both New Zealand and even globally around how we're funding stuff. Now, going back to the last item, everyone's concerned about how we're going to fund this stuff, right? This is just this is another confirmation that we are going to fund ourselves in a sustainable way. So for me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. If we don't sign it, I don't know what are the other declarations left to do. But this, for me, is just something that we are already doing. We're doing it well. We were doing it so well that we actually closed off a green bond issue early because it was so oversubscribed. So I just support it, knowing that it's the work that we're currently doing, and we are committed as a council to sustainability for the future. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Councillor Simpson. Anyone else like to speak? Okay, thank you very much. And just want to say thank you to the team. I know there's a lot of work going on with a much reduced staff number at the moment. So we are very proud to have this declaration signed. As Councillor Simpson said, we are doing most of the work in here, but this further entrenches and pushes us to do more work, but also encourages and shows others. We're part of 97 cities, part of C40. Those 97 cities actually are part of 1/3 of the world's emissions. So us together doing these things, only 14 cities have signed on so far, so a small piece. So if we can encourage other cities to sign on and do the work, we divested from fossil fuels in 2017, and then with the green bonds have been ramping up the work and borrowing in a different way, which is actually more affordable as well as more sustainable. So thank you very much. We will put that to the vote. All those in favour?
Aye.
Any opposed? Perfect. Thank you very much. And we will quickly move through the other two items so we can all you can all go and head to lunch. We have no. There's no lunch here. You're going to have to go to the kebab shop. The Forward Work Programme. There are a few changes.